On Christmas Eve 2002, a pregnant woman vanished without a trace, leaving behind a quiet house, a wandering dog, and a mystery that would grip the entire nation. What began as a desperate search for Laci Peterson soon unraveled into a chilling tale of secrets, suspicion, and betrayal. One that turned an ordinary family into the center of one of the most unforgettable criminal cases in modern history. Laci Peterson began the morning of December the 24th, 2002, with simple plans: walk the dog, finish errands, and prepare for Christmas Eve. She was 8 months pregnant and expecting her son Connor in a few weeks. Scott Peterson, her husband, left the house earlier, saying he was going fishing at the Berkeley Marina. Their morning appeared normal. No arguments, no signs of trouble. Sometime after Scott left, Laci was seen by neighbors walking the dog. These sightings later became important reference points, marking the last confirmed moments anyone saw her alive. After that, her movements became unclear. By early afternoon, the dog was found wandering the neighborhood alone, with its leash still attached, but no one knew where Lassie was. When Scott returned home later in the day, Lassie was not there. Her car was still in the driveway, her purse was inside the house, and nothing appeared disturbed. He made calls to family to ask if they had seen her, but no one had. As concern grew, Laci was reported missing, and what began as an ordinary holiday morning quickly shifted into a case that would soon capture national attention. When Scott Peterson walked into the house on the evening of that day, the first thing he noticed was the absence of anything unusual. The lights were on, Laci's belongings were where she normally left them, and the house showed no signs of a struggle. But the one thing that mattered, Laci herself, was missing. The dog had already been returned to the backyard by a neighbor who found it wandering with its leash on. Scott saw this and immediately knew something wasn't right. Laci never left the dog outside alone for long, and she would not have gone anywhere without her purse, which still sat inside. Her keys, wallet, and phone were also untouched. Her car remained in the driveway. Everything indicated she had planned to be home. Scott called Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, asking if Laci was with her. She wasn't, and Sharon's concern grew instantly. Laci was responsible, predictable, and nearing her due date. Disappearing without telling anyone made no sense. Family members arrived quickly, and the uneasy realization set in. Laci wasn't just late or distracted, she was gone. The house itself offered no explanation. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken objects, and no indication that Laci had prepared to leave. It looked as though she had simply stopped what she was doing and vanished. When officers arrived, they found the same unsettling lack of clues. The Christmas tree stood decorated, presents wrapped, and the kitchen quiet. Nothing helped answer the central question: where was Laci? As night set in, the house grew heavier with worry. Friends and relatives searched nearby streets and parks, hoping she might have collapsed or gone into labor, but found nothing. The quiet home, tidy, still, and waiting, became the starting point of a mystery that would rapidly grow far beyond Modesto. By the morning of the next day, December 25th, the search for Laci Peterson had already begun to expand beyond what her family could manage alone. Police officers, volunteers, and neighbors gathered quickly once the news spread that a pregnant woman had vanished without explanation. Modesto residents who had never met Laci showed up because the situation felt urgent and unnatural. A woman about to give birth simply didn't disappear on Christmas Eve. Law enforcement organized the first structured search efforts. Officers checked parks, walking paths, nearby fields, and areas Laci was known to frequent. Search dogs were deployed, but their alerts were inconsistent, offering no clear direction. The home showed no sign of a struggle, and the surrounding area offered no immediate clue. The lack of physical evidence pushed the search outward. Within hours, volunteers lined up at makeshift stations to pick up flyers and maps. They walked neighborhoods, knocked on doors, and asked residents if they had seen anything unusual. People hung posters in shop windows and taped them to streetlights. The image of Laci, smiling, very pregnant, spread quickly across the city. The emotional impact was immediate. Many felt personally invested, even though they had no connection to the Petersons. As Christmas Day turned into December 26th and then December 27th, the search grew more intense. Helicopters scanned rural areas from above. Boats were sent to check local waterways. The police began using sonar equipment in nearby reservoirs. The scope widened because no one could pinpoint where Laci might have gone or what had happened in that short window between her walk and her disappearance. At the same time, media attention increased rapidly. Reporters arrived in Modesto, turning the missing person case into a national story. Cameras appeared at search sites, interviewing volunteers who described the growing fear that the missing woman case was shifting into something far more serious. Friends and family members became central figures in the effort, handing out flyers and speaking publicly to keep attention on Laci. They expressed hope, but also frustration at the lack of progress. Each day with no leads made the situation feel heavier. The community kept searching because the alternative was unthinkable. A pregnant woman was gone, and there was no explanation. The scale of the effort reflected the urgency. Modesto wasn't just helping, it was mobilizing. And as the days passed with no breakthrough, the city began to realize it was facing a case that would not resolve quickly and might not end the way anyone hoped. As the search for Laci intensified, the media presence around the Peterson home grew rapidly. News vans lined the street, cameras were set up on tripods, and reporters delivered live updates throughout the day. What began as a local missing person case had now become a national story, and every movement by family members, especially Scott Peterson, was being recorded, replayed, and scrutinized. From the first moments he spoke publicly, viewers and some investigators noticed Scott's demeanor. He appeared calm, controlled, and at times overly composed for a man whose pregnant wife had disappeared. While emotional reactions vary from person to person, the contrast between his tone and the urgency of the situation raised quiet questions. People wanted to see fear, panic, or desperation. Scott displayed almost none of that on camera. Behind the scenes, detectives paid close attention. Public interviews can reveal inconsistencies or emotional cues, and Scott's behavior became part of their developing assessment. At this point, there was no concrete evidence implicating him, but the absence of typical distress stood out. Detectives also began to look more closely at Scott's timeline, comparing it with witness accounts, phone records, and his stated movements that morning. Meanwhile, the cameras created additional pressure on everyone involved. Laci's family pleaded for her safe return, making heartfelt appeals that spread across national news. These clips heightened public empathy for Laci and suspicion toward anyone who seemed detached. The contrast between her family's visible pain and Scott's calmness drew increased attention from viewers. Reporters started asking more pointed questions. They probed Scott about his last morning with Laci, his fishing trip, and why he had chosen that particular location on Christmas Eve. Each time, Scott maintained his composure, offering the same explanations. But instead of calming speculation, his responses fueled it. As days passed with no significant leads, the media coverage shifted from hopeful updates to deeper analysis. Talk shows invited experts to discuss possible scenarios, motives, and red flags. Scott became an unavoidable figure in these discussions, even though police had not named him a suspect. The cameras also changed how the investigation unfolded. Detectives were aware that every development, statement, or misstep would be broadcast instantly. Public interpretation was becoming intertwined with law enforcement's progress. What had started as a simple missing person search was now becoming a public examination of a husband's behavior under pressure. As investigators studied Scott Peterson's behavior and timeline, they also began examining his personal life. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and anyone who might know something Laci hadn't shared. What started as routine background checking led to a discovery that would completely shift the direction of the investigation. Within days, detectives learned that Scott had been involved with another woman. Her name wasn't yet public, but the information alone was enough to raise serious concerns. A missing pregnant wife and an undisclosed affair created a combination investigators could not ignore. They needed details: how long the relationship had lasted, what Scott had said about his marriage, and whether this woman knew anything relevant to the case. When they contacted the woman, Amber Frey, she provided information that stunned even seasoned detectives. She explained that Scott had told her he was single and that his wife had died. Not only had he hidden his marriage, but he had also gone so far as to portray himself as a grieving widower before Laci had even disappeared. Amber had no idea who Scott really was until she saw his face on the news. The moment she recognized him, she contacted police immediately. Amber agreed to cooperate fully. She handed over recordings, messages, and details of conversations with Scott, materials that investigators quickly realized could become crucial pieces of evidence. These recordings showed Scott continuing to lie, even as the search for Laci was growing nationwide. The words he said to Amber during that time did not match the desperate, heartbroken husband the public expected to see. When news of the affair became public, the impact was immediate. Public support for Scott collapsed almost overnight. Many who had once volunteered in the search felt angry and betrayed. Laci's family was devastated to learn that Scott had been unfaithful, especially while Laci was carrying their son. The affair did not prove what happened to Laci, but it shifted the perception of Scott from a concerned husband to someone with possible motive and deception. Detectives now had a new lens through which to interpret his actions, his statements, and his inconsistencies. Once investigators learned about Scott's affair, their attention shifted toward verifying his movements on the morning Laci disappeared. Scott had stated that he went fishing at the Berkeley Marina on December 24th. At first, this detail seemed ordinary, though unusual for Christmas Eve. But now, with the new context surrounding his personal life, detectives began to question whether the marina trip was simply a coincidence or something more significant. They examined his receipts, phone records, and the route he claimed to have taken. His alibi placed him on the water alone, with no witnesses who could confirm his exact location or actions. Investigators visited the marina, checking for anything that might have been left behind: tire marks, discarded items, or signs of disturbed ground. Nothing concrete appeared, but the area itself was large and difficult to search thoroughly. Because of the vast shoreline and deep water, detectives brought in boats equipped with sonar to scan beneath the waves. The goal was not to find a specific object, but to identify anything unusual: shapes, disturbances, or areas where something might have been submerged. Early sonar sweeps revealed unclear readings that could not be confirmed as evidence. Still, the location remained suspicious due to Scott's presence there that morning. Meanwhile, investigators continued gathering information from the Peterson home. They analyzed the boat Scott had purchased not long before Laci's disappearance, a purchase Laci reportedly didn't know about. They also checked the warehouse where Scott kept the boat, examining the anchor materials, concrete residue, and any unfamiliar items. These findings did not provide a definitive answer, but added to a growing list of concerns. As the search extended into rivers, reservoirs, and rural areas, the Berkeley Marina remained a central point of focus. Even without definitive proof, detectives believed the area was too closely tied to Scott's timeline to ignore. Search teams spent hours scanning the water, marking potential spots for further investigation. The more investigators learned, the more they felt the answers were not on land but hidden somewhere beneath the surface of the bay. Each new piece of information strengthened their suspicion that the marina trip was not random. It was connected. It mattered. At this stage, they still lacked a breakthrough, a physical clue, a confirmed sighting, or a discovery that could answer what had happened to Laci. But all signs pointed toward the water, and investigators prepared for the possibility that the bay itself might eventually reveal the truth. By April 2003, Laci Peterson had been missing for nearly 4 months. The search efforts had slowed but never stopped, and investigators remained convinced that the answers lay somewhere in or around the San Francisco Bay. Although months of sonar scans and water searches had produced no definitive evidence, detectives kept the marina area on their list of high-priority locations due to Scott's presence there on the day Laci disappeared. Then in mid-April, the case took a sudden and devastating turn. After a series of storms and unusually strong tides, a body washed ashore near the Berkeley Marina, an area directly connected to Scott's alibi. The remains were of a fetus, later determined to be a near full-term baby boy. Not long after, a second body, an adult female, was discovered nearby. Both bodies had been exposed to the elements, making identification more difficult, but investigators immediately recognized the possibility that these could be Laci and her unborn son, Connor. The locations of the discoveries were significant. They were within the general water flow patterns that experts had previously examined when trying to determine where a body might drift if it had entered the bay. Although no one could say for certain how long the remains had been in the water, the proximity to Scott's fishing location made the findings impossible to dismiss. Forensic testing began immediately. DNA analysis confirmed what investigators feared. The remains were Laci Peterson and her unborn child. The confirmation shifted the case from a missing person search to a homicide investigation and provided the most concrete evidence yet that Laci's death was connected to the bay. The discovery also accelerated the pace of the investigation. For months, detectives had operated without physical evidence, tying the case to a specific location. Now they had two bodies found exactly where they had long suspected. Although the condition of the remains made it difficult to determine the precise cause of death, the fact that both mother and child were found in the same area was a critical breakthrough. The public reacted with shock and sorrow. The hope that Laci might be found alive ended abruptly, replaced by grief and anger. For investigators, the recovery of the bodies provided the crucial link they needed, evidence that pointed directly back to Scott's trip to the bay. The water had finally given up its secrets, and the case was no longer built on suspicion alone. After the remains of Laci and her unborn son were identified, investigators moved quickly. Months of suspicion, inconsistencies, and circumstantial evidence had become far more substantial now that the bodies had been found near the exact location where Scott Peterson claimed to have gone fishing on the day Laci disappeared. Detectives believed they had enough to charge him with murder. The question was no longer if they would arrest him, but when. As they prepared the arrest, Scott's behavior drew additional concern. He had recently changed his appearance, bleached hair, a goatee, and was carrying significant amounts of cash. He also had multiple cell phones, as well as camping gear and maps. Although none of these items alone proved intent, combined they suggested he might be preparing to leave the country. On April 18, 2003, officers located Scott in La Jolla, near the Mexican border. Detectives and federal agents had been monitoring him closely, knowing that public release of the body identification could trigger a flight attempt. When they moved in, Scott did not resist. He was taken into custody without incident and transported back to Modesto, where he was formally charged. Prosecutors announced 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for unborn baby Connor. The charges were severe, and the state signaled immediately that it would pursue the death penalty. For Laci's family, the arrest was both heartbreaking and necessary. They had long hoped for answers, and now they faced the reality that the man they once welcomed into their family was accused of taking both Laci's life and her child's. News of the arrest spread across the country within minutes. Scott's face appeared on every network, now not as a worried husband but as a suspect in a high-profile murder case. Public reaction was intense. Many had already formed strong opinions based on months of media coverage, and the discovery of the bodies solidified those beliefs. For investigators, the arrest marked a major milestone, but the work was far from over. They now had the challenge of preparing for a complex, heavily scrutinized trial. Evidence had to be organized, witness testimony prepared, and timelines finalized. Scott's arrest changed the tone of the entire case. The disappearance that had once shocked a community had now become a criminal prosecution. The search for answers shifted into the pursuit of justice, and the case moved into its next and most public phase, the courtroom. The trial of Scott Peterson began in 2004 and immediately drew massive national attention. Cameras were not allowed inside the courtroom, but every development, statement, and witness appearance was reported within minutes. The prosecution and defense both understood that this case was not just a legal battle, it was a public event watched by millions. Prosecutors presented a clear narrative. Scott had motive, opportunity, and a pattern of deception. They highlighted his affair with Amber Frey, emphasizing that he had lied to her repeatedly and portrayed himself as a widower before Laci even disappeared. They argued that Scott wanted freedom from his marriage and responsibilities, and that Laci's pregnancy did not fit the life he wanted. They also focused heavily on the marina. Scott had been in the exact area where Laci and baby Connor's remains were found months later. Though no witness saw him commit the crime and no direct physical evidence tied him to the bodies, prosecutors argued that the circumstantial evidence formed a consistent and compelling picture. They pointed to his boat, his purchase of materials, and inconsistencies in his timeline. The defense countered by attacking the reliability of the investigation. They argued that police focused on Scott too early and ignored other possibilities. They pointed out that eyewitness reports of a pregnant woman walking the dog were not thoroughly resolved. They also emphasized that the prosecution had no concrete cause of death and no definitive evidence showing how or where Laci was killed. Amber Frey's testimony became one of the most impactful moments of the trial. She detailed her relationship with Scott, the lies he told, and the conversations they had during the search for Laci. The recordings she provided showed Scott speaking calmly and making holiday plans while the investigation was still underway, behavior that damaged his credibility with the jury. Throughout the trial, the public followed daily updates. Analysts debated every piece of evidence, while the courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Jurors listened to weeks of testimony, including experts on tides, forensic analysis, and behavioral patterns. When closing arguments concluded, the jury faced the difficult task of evaluating a case built largely on circumstantial evidence. Yet the combination of Scott's lies, his marina trip, his behavior, and the discovery of the bodies near his stated location formed a narrative they ultimately found persuasive. After deliberation, the jury returned its decision. Scott Peterson was guilty of the murders of Laci and unborn baby Connor. The verdict marked the end of one of the most closely followed trials in modern history. Laci's family held each other, overcome with emotion. For them, the verdict was a form of validation, a recognition of the loss they had endured and the months of uncertainty that had consumed their lives. They had hoped for justice since the day Laci went missing, and now they had it, even if it could never bring her back. Scott showed little visible reaction. His attorneys maintained that the evidence was circumstantial and vowed to appeal. But the jury had spoken, and the message was clear. They believed Scott had killed his pregnant wife and attempted to cover it up. The penalty phase followed shortly afterward. Prosecutors argued that the severity of the crime warranted the death penalty. They emphasized the betrayal of trust, the impact on Laci's family, and the murder of an unborn child. The defense urged the jury to choose life in prison, pointing to the lack of definitive physical evidence. After further deliberation, the jury recommended death. The judge agreed and formally sentenced Scott Peterson to death row. This decision marked another major moment in the case, solidifying the outcome and closing the trial portion of the story. But even with the verdict and sentence delivered, a deep void remained. Laci and Connor were gone, and no legal decision could repair the emotional damage left behind. The Peterson home that once prepared for a new baby now represented loss and tragedy. The community that had searched tirelessly now faced the reality that their hopes for a different ending were gone. For Laci's family, the verdict brought accountability, but not closure. For Scott, it marked the start of a long process of appeals that would stretch on for years. And for the public, the case became one of the most memorable and divisive legal stories of its time.